Well, hello, boys and girls. Welcome to Business and Its Environment. How are our graduate students today? In great shape, I hope. Well, hopefully you've gotten our textbook, the Steiner text, Business, Government, and Society, whether it's the soft cover, which I hope is the most inexpensive one for you, 13th edition, or the 13th edition hard copy, or the 13th edition international edition. Hopefully you've got the same text. Now, the pagination of those three texts, even though they're all the 13th edition, may be off a bit, but that's fine. The chapters are identical. So just turn to the assigned chapter for the day, regardless of what page it is, and you'll be good to go. Well, welcome. I'm glad to have you here for our first session involving chapters 1 and 2 of Business and Its Environment. So, as you already know, I hope that this essentially is the capstone course for your MBA or MPA program, where I'm going to try and bring together material that you have covered in a number of your other graduate courses. Because while this involves certainly ethics and the law, the reality is that business is not compartmentalized. It is, in fact, fundamentally integrated. So let's take, for example, an accounting firm. So one might think, well, the only thing you need to know in running an accounting firm is accounting, right? Probably not right, because you probably need some marketing, right? In order to advertise your accounting business, you certainly will need some finance and how to handle the financial transactions and cash flow and so forth. You probably better be sensitive to management in terms of how you deal and manage and evaluate workers. So business, in fact, regardless of the type of business, is integrated. And so we're going to be viewing business through an integrated lens. So I think you're going to find it fascinating. Fascinating. So, beginning very early in your chapter, we're looking at the ExxonMobil company, which obviously is an enormous company in terms of size, that originally grew out of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company, which was a huge monolith in terms of being the biggest oil company in America at the time. And of course, even from John Rockefeller's day, Standard Oil, and after it broke off and became ExxonMobil, were fiercely competitive, profit-focused, and efficient, companies. And nothing unique about that. Most growing companies have those characteristics as well. But of course, as Standard Oil morphed into ExxonMobil and other oil companies, it had to evolve. It had to change. It had to respond to, society. And so we're seeing today that American oil companies, which are, of course, multinationals like ExxonMobil, they're certainly being challenged by non-public oil companies like Aramco in Saudi Arabia. So you've got government-owned oil companies that certainly compete right alongside, our privately owned, companies. And so you're going to always face, some competition with, government-owned entities. But as we know from experience, government-owned entities are not always the most efficient for a variety of political reasons. So certainly government is going to play a key role in looking at and evaluating business and its operations, because governments regulate business for a variety of public purposes. Certainly from the social perspective, businesses are impacted by environmental, civil rights, labor, and consumer groups, which we're going to talk about today. Certainly, markets are more and more contested. There's always more and more competition ongoing out there in both the oil and the gas industry. And offshore drilling is certainly a new issue that is now that used to be off limits, but now the Trump administration has now removed the restrictions regarding off coast drilling. So we'll see how that evolves, but that certainly is going to have an impact on the oil and gas industry. So certainly multinationals like ExxonMobil have to compete on a pretty broad international basis. The rules in selling oil in Poland obviously involves the European Union, and is probably different than selling oil to Japan, for example. And so we like to say multinational American companies need to be agile, mobile, and hostile. So we're going to be looking at not just ExxonMobil, but other multinationals and large companies with respect to how government institutions and societal processes impact them. To say that a business can do whatever it wants, regardless of governmental regulation or societal expectations, is simply untrue. In fact, business will be the first ones to say, good heavens, you should see all of the governmental and societal expectations that we're being expected to respond to. So I think ExxonMobil is a good illustration of what we're talking about, and that it certainly has an impact on our domestic as well as international market. But note that ExxonMobil, while they only pump 8% of the world's daily output of oil, they have only 2% of the globe's oil reserves. So they are perpetually searching for new oil fields like offshore drilling possibilities. So going back in history to 1911, when the Supreme Court of the United States broke up Standard Oil, why did they do that? Well, hopefully you will recall from your legal environment course, and for those of you who've had business law, you should remember the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. The whole point being to break up the trusts that were limiting competition. And in fact, any business would like to be dominant in their market, and they would like to be a monopolist. They'd like to have no competition at all. So let's take a look even here at USD. If we didn't have online book purchasing opportunities, the only place you could purchase a textbook would be at Barnes & Noble. Well, what would their prices for textbooks be if they had no competition? Probably not low, right? And so I think it goes with any business, that if you don't have competition, if you don't have competitive markets, you're going to have high prices and low quality of service. So for those reasons, the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act was enacted to try and break up the trusts, the monopolies, and to create competition. And so that's why the Supreme Court in 1911, using the authority of the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act, broke Standard Oil up into a variety of smaller companies to incentivize them to compete against one another. So clearly we have a growth industry in the energy industry. But, businesses like ourselves, um, from time to time, find themselves involved in an accident. Now, just as we have automobile and other types of accidents that we don't intend to occur, the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill up in Alaska, uh, in the Prince William Sound, was an accident that occurred certainly through negligence. So Exxon Exxon has a number of super tankers, and one of them, unfortunately, was being captained by an alcoholic who was under the influence of vodka at the time. Uh, he left the bridge, leaving an inexperienced and unauthorized watch officer to guide the supertanker through a tricky sea maneuver that ended up with it rupturing its bottom and side as a result of being run up on a reef due to poor seamanship. So obviously, this created a fairly major problem for Exxon in the sense that it unleashed gazillions of gallons of oil that destroyed fishing and wildlife there in the Prince William Sound area. And it impacted numerous Alaskans, fishermen and others who made their living from the Prince William Sound. So you can imagine, and because I remember it in 1989 quite vividly. At the time, I had just moved to the Pentagon, and so this was a cause célèbre in Washington, D.C. And of course, everybody wanted Exxon's throat when this occurred. And there certainly was what we call the social contract expectation that, all right, one of Exxon's supertankers created this enormous environmental disaster. Well, they ought to clean it up. And there certainly was a government expectation they would do that too. What was fascinating, of course, is that there was no law in effect that required Exxon to clean up its oil spill. How about that? There was no law in effect that required them to clean up their own mess that they created. Well, of course, you can imagine there's a societal expectation, not to mention a governmental expectation, that the ethical and right thing to do is to clean up your own mess, right? Unfortunately for Exxon, Exxon took the position, they took the low road, saying, look, there's no law that requires us to clean up. We're, obviously unhappy that this happens, but it's a government responsibility. Well, over the next 20 years, Exxon, of course, gets sued by everybody from the government to the Eskimos in Alaska. And they end up forking out not only $2.4 billion, plus $2.2 billion in civil suits. They obviously suffered enormous brand reputation damage. And so today, when you see Exxon commercials on television, the commercials they always run are these environmental commercials that Exxon is, really into the environment. Well, I'm not so sure about that, but they certainly were not interested in the environment back in 1989, and they took the low road in terms of resolving the situation, the mess that they had created. And so it's very true that business invites scrutiny when things go wrong. Well, how did things go wrong? Well, Exxon took the wrong management decision about cleaning up the mess, and it was downhill from there. So to every wrongful action by business, there is going to be a congressional or legislative reaction. In particular, in 1990, Congress enacted the Oil Pollution Act, the Oil Pollution Offshore Act. Well, this not only, of course, made offenders liable up to a distance of 200 miles from shore for any pollution they created, but it also uh, initiated a 5-cent tax on every barrel of oil that would create a trust fund to pay for uh, oil pollution cleanup efforts by the government. So again, all brought to us by the Exxon Valdez incident. And so when accidents occur, there are routinely going to be responses to them. Now compare that with the BP oil platform explosion in the Gulf of Mexico. How did BP respond to that in comparison to the Exxon experience? Quite differently. They didn't take the position, not our problem, it's the government's. On the contrary, they rushed in, not only obviously to try and cap their well, but obviously to clean up the damage. But they also appointed right away a claims officer, a claims person who actually happened to be the same person who was the claims officer after 9/11 in dealing with all of the insurance claims and whatnot from people who had family members and others who died or were injured in the 9/11 explosions. So BP, I think, took the high road and ended up paying a lot less than what Exxon ended up being liable for. And so we have, if you will, expectations. Society has expectations, and government has expectations of business. And when business violates those expectations, there are consequences. So let's, take a look at what our author, Mr. Steiner, likes to point out are models or prisms by which we can evaluate business actions. So the first one is the market capitalism model, where business does operate within a market environment and responds to market forces. Quite normal, right? But is shielded to some extent from direct social and political forces by the environment. You probably will remember the old invisible hand theory of Adam Smith that says, look, when every business engages in its competitive and comparative advantage, at the end of the day, good things will result for society with the coming together of this confluence of business activity and expectations. The dominance model is the second way of looking at business and its operations, where we have corporations and a powerful elite that control a system that seems to advantage a few. So, for example, Senator Bernie Sanders, during the presidential campaign, brought to our attention that, 1% of America's population owns over 50% of its assets. Well, that's quite an argument, right? And so does it appear that, business and its owners are exercising rights that are superior to that of, societies and, of course, the public good? Well, good question. Now, my good friend Ralph Nader, hopefully you've heard of Ralph. Ralph is a consumer advocate and has been since in the 1960s. He published his first book, Unsafe at Any Speed, and I got to know Mr. Nader in 1972 when I was in college. And he says corporations are the most pernicious entities in America. Let me say that again. He says that corporations are the most pernicious entities in America. So he has a pretty negative view of American business corporations as being self-serving and not particularly interested in the public good. Well, I think there are arguments that, good arguments that can counter that, but he certainly is entitled to his observation. A third model for looking at and evaluating business actions is the countervailing forces model that sees business, government, and society as competing interests, where they, compete with one another. We certainly see that in the Congress. So certainly business has representatives in business. They have lobbyists. They certainly donate enormous amounts of money to politicians. The first rule in politics, of course, is reelection. And what's the milk of reelection? Of course, money, money, money. Well, who gives the money? I don't think you or I do, but business does. The stakeholder model says, look, stakeholders are both benefited and burdened by business. And who are primary and secondary stakeholders? Primary, of course, are the owners, the customers, and the employees, communities. But you can have secondary stakeholders as well who are affected by business activity, like, the Exxon Valdez disaster. So we ask ourselves, so what is the fundamental purpose of business? Well, hopefully it's to make a profit, right? So even if you happen to be a nonprofit business, like, let's say, for example, Sanford or Avera, healthcare systems, look, if they don't make a profit, they go out of business. What characterizes them as a nonprofit is they don't pay dividends, their capital gains, and they don't have shareholders. But at the end of the day, they have to make a profit or they're going to go out of business themselves. Of course, we're not surprised to learn that, look, business is operating in a dynamic environment. What do we mean by that? It means it's an ever-changing environment. And so, in his great book, Alvin Toffler, he wrote in the 1970s, his book was called Future Shock. And he said, look, the only constant in life is change. And I think he's right. And so if business cannot adapt to change, then of course business will die over a period of time. So the Royal Dutch Shell story in your text is an interesting illustration of a company attempting to look to the future and plan for the future. Well, I think Yogi Berra had it right when he said, the problem with the future is you just can't see it. Well, I think he has a point. And so one tries to plan for things that you think you can foresee, but there are always variables at play in the marketplace that may catch you unawares. And so having a nimble organization that can respond quickly to new events is something that certainly most successful businesses possess. So again, using Royal Dutch Shell, which of course is a Dutch company, as an example, they tried to come up with a future business model that took into account liberalization, globalization, and technological change. Okay, three big, really interesting approaches. So maybe they were trying to be a company for all seasons, but they were trying to plan. I like to advocate the 6 P's for most businesses: previous, planning, prevents, pitifully poor performance. Let me say that again. The 6 P's: previous, planning, prevents, pitifully poor performance. And so the military is well known for its fanatical planning exercises, and businesses too. And I think the Royal Dutch Shell is a good illustration and point. They created 2 potential business scenarios, what they called the scramble scenario and the blueprint scenario. The scramble scenario is where, hey, the world isn't responding to the energy challenge very well, and so it's a catch-as-catch-can craziness out there. Well, how is Royal Dutch Shell positioned to respond in a scramble, if you will, chaotic business environment? The blueprint plan was that, well, the world's a little more prompt about the future of the global energy, system. And so they tried to approach their future planning from these two, albeit different perspectives. Now, we have seen everything from the 1970s, where we had oil embargoes. OPEC embargoed oil from shipment to the United States, resulting in enormous gas lines and other types of things. Those of us that lived through the 70s will remember that. But, we've got things such as, short supplies, supply and demand governs everything. And when then, we have a large supply, a glut like we have currently, prices are going to be low. But of course, when there's a supply shortage, hey, markets are going to jack, prices up. But when we have, climate warming, we've had all sorts of ancillary effects that have occurred over time as a result of gluts and shortages. And so how do you plan for these things? Well, we're back to scramble and blueprint. Steiner, our author, says, look, there are essentially 9 historical forces that produce change in the business environment. We would all agree the first one is the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, which obviously began in England, morphed to Europe, and certainly eventually to the United States, that brought about huge changes in our industrial economy. We certainly saw industrial growth grow. I mean, a good example is the world GDP increase between the years 1950 and 2000. In 50 years, the growth in GDP exceeded all that came previously in human history. Isn't that something? Well, what do you think it's going to be between 2000 and 2050? Probably exponential, right? Probably exponential. Well, when you have this type of growth, does it remake society? Certainly, I think technology is the best example I can share with you that proves that point. Inequality is considered to be a motive force in all political, systems. What do you think? True or false? I think, certainly in developed countries, countries are concerned about inequality. We certainly are here in the United States. So an interesting fact is that income inequality between industrialized nations and less developed countries, that inequality is growing. However, income inequality is also rising. But what is fascinating is that when it comes to poverty, poverty has been decreasing. Isn't that interesting? While inequality between, if you will, the haves and have-nots has been increasing, poverty, in fact, has been decreasing. What about population? Population obviously is an important factor, not only from employment, but certainly from consumption points of view. The consumer spending is the number one fact in the United States for, as we can see, sale of goods and services. Consumers, not exports, not government, but consumers are the leading cause of sales and services. That's what drives sales and services. Now, if consumers didn't show up to buy stuff at Christmas, the economy would go down in a tank. So the author, talks about, so what's the population of the world going to look like, in the future? And so these are interesting, numbers for you to review. This certainly is going to have, economic impact. We would all agree that technology is a powerful force for change. I mean, I grew up without cell phones, but today cell phones, have displaced conversation among people. I was at Washington State University here a year ago, and during the summertime, and there was a group of summer school students outside, and I would say there was probably 10 or 12 of them, and they all were looking at their cell phones. Nobody in the group of 12 was talking with somebody else. They all 12 were playing with their cell phones. And as I was looking at this quiet group, I was wondering, are they suffering a socialization depredation? Is this necessarily a good thing for them? So it is true that technology changes faster than human beliefs and institutions, and so it can certainly strain society. I know when I walk down the hallway here at Beacom and a student is looking at their cell phone, I invariably will say to them, "Hi, how are you?" And they immediately look up, incredibly startled. So I get a little bit of a high from startling students when they're doing that. Globalization, of course, is another historical way to view business, because globalization is increasing, that's for sure, involving economic, political, military, scientific, environmental interdependence. Certainly the whole purpose of the European Union, which was created in the 1950s, if you will, as an outcome of World War II, by having Europe, these 29 European countries, soon to be 28 or 27, by having them become interdependent. So let's take France and Germany, which have been at war with each other for centuries. By having France rely upon Germany for industrial goods, and by having Germany rely upon France for agricultural goods, by having each country specialize in their comparative advantage and becoming interdependent with one another, this topic of war became absurd. You can't attack the country that's feeding you. That's bad for business, as we like to say. War is bad for business. And so globalization, as the European Union demonstrates, is certainly key to preserving peace on our planet. So it certainly has brought some strains, but it nevertheless, I think, overall has produced a good outcome. We certainly have had no wars in Europe as a consequence after centuries of wars. A fifth historical lens, if you will, are that nation states are international actors that define rules and incentives in global markets. Yeah, we see that all the time. And right now, trying to amend NAFTA, for example, is turning out to be a pretty heavy lift for the United States, Mexico, and Canada. So we'll see how that turns out. Stay tuned. Certainly, global market forces limit the power of governments to control their domestic economies. Competition, is international. And if we want to shut our doors, clearly we're not going to be exporting. And you could start some of the trade wars like we had after 1929 with the Smoot-Hartley tariff, that when we start raising tariffs, other countries do the same. We stop allowing imports to come in, then they're going to retaliate. Our competitors are going to retaliate. And before you know it, the whole world is getting sick. So certainly some nations are driven by ideology. You certainly see that in Arab, worlds. Um, so for example, not just in Arab countries, but there are other countries as well, uh, where charging interest is considered sinful. And so you've got to develop workarounds in business to find out how to handle what's the substitute going to be for um, charging interest. You got to find a workaround. There's always been, Darwinian competition in the marketplace for ideas in the sense of, look, only the survival of the fittest uh, should survive. And so, again, as part of change, religions, languages, and cultural beliefs, change as a result of the demise of some economies. Things, change. Things change with time. Great leadership. I think just leadership is important in not just in business, but certainly in government. And so government leaders, as we're seeing in Great Britain, try and manage Brexit. It's involves the intersection of powerful social forces. What is Brexit? That is the departure of Great Britain from the European Union going to cause in terms of not just access to and from Great Britain, but what about labor? There has been an exodus out of Great Britain of foreign nationals. Well, is eventually, Great Britain going to have a labor shortage problem, and is that going to negatively affect their economy? So, and then of course, there's always chance. Chance is a force that, again, going back to Yogi Berra, you can't see the future. And so things can happen. You could have crazies like the North Korean great leader who can, set loose weapons that may alter uh, everybody's view of the world. And we know war is bad for business. And so whether it be small wars or big wars, they're all bad for business. Now, our author says, look, there are 6 external environments. By that he means there are 6 influences on business. Certainly the first one being economic. And look, economics in any business drive it. And when a business is making a profit, hey, great days, right? We're having a good time. When we're losing money, oh baby, that has an impact on people's lives, right? From the CEO all the way down to the lowest paid employee. Now, one of the things that I've learned is that, successful businesses grow. They don't just stay the same. And what's the problem with business growth? I learned the hard way with a student company called Coyotopoly that grew from a small company that had just grew out of control, was that it needed more resources, more effort, more of everything. And so growth has to be annotated with more of everything. Well, if you don't want more employees, if you don't want more governmental regulation, if you don't want more requirements, maybe growth is not for you. And you may want to be thinking about spinning off your company, as we did with the South Dakota Shakespeare Festival, because it just got to be too much for us to handle. A second influence, external environment on business, is technological. We would all agree that, nanotechnology, biotechnology, digital technology, good heavens, generates turbulence in the environments of many businesses. And so it obviously creates, threats and opportunities, right? Like cyber warfare. Cultural, certainly business is affected by culture. And so as business, grows, shares knowledge, values, norms, customs, and rituals of society. All of those things, affect and impact, business. So let me take, for example, Israel. Israel is a religious state. Many of the Muslim countries in the Middle East are religious states too. And as a religious state, Israel on Friday has what they call Shabbat, or if you will, that's their Sabbath. Well, businesses shut down in Israel on Friday, beginning at about noon. They start shutting down, and they're all shut down by dark. Well, they don't do business on Friday. Furthermore, even discussing business or even carrying money is against their religious norms. Interesting, huh? So, again, there is a situation, a cultural impact. And so if you're going to do business in Israel, you're not going to do it on Friday, and you better plan accordingly. So certainly there are industrialization issues that countries have to work through. How far do they want to go? Does everybody want to industrialize, or do we want to look at comparative advantage in agriculture or whatever? And of course, government is always going to be another influence, historical influence, as we saw with the Sherman 1890 Antitrust Act. We certainly have seen it with Sarbanes-Oxley, right? In 2002, we saw in 2008 Dodd-Frank, right? These governmental regulations all impact business in a variety of ways. The law, my favorite subject, laws and regulations, address issues like the fiduciary duty, the duty of utmost trust that employees owe their companies, but that also companies owe others as well. So we're certainly looking at the growth in the number and complexity of laws and regulations. Any society that grows, you're going to see environmental and other types of regulations. Trying to turn back the clock and say, well, we don't need environmental regulation anymore, so let's get rid of all that. We don't need regulation to prevent too big to fail. Trying to turn back the clock, I would suggest in the long term is futile and unwise. That's just not the way the world works. It moves forward. It doesn't move backward. And certainly expanding liability. So we're seeing, lawsuits get filed all the time. Shoot, we're watching Flint, Michigan residents suing everybody in sight who had anything to do with the lead pipe water disaster that they had up there. And so that's going to be interesting to see how that finally settles out. A sixth historical influence is, natural. That look, the environment, as I just mentioned with the Flint River situation. Hey, disrupting ecosystems, there can be liability, financial liability. And so, we close with the issue about, the American Fur Trading Company and how that, evolved over time in Jacob Astor's, time. And so with the Industrial Revolution and whatnot, we've seen the American, fur company evolve and then, eventually disappear over a period of time. So business has evolving cycles, if you will. And if you're going to grow, you're going to need to, as the Royal Dutch Shell case represents, you're going to have to, scramble and also have blueprint approaches for growing your company. And if you don't grow, and I think Karl Marx is right when he said, what ceases to grow begins to decay. And so if you don't grow your company, it will decay. It just doesn't remain static. So these are the thoughts that I wanted to share with you during our first lecture session together. Let me close where I began, which is to invite your questions regarding any of the material that we covered today, or anything that comes up on your screen that you need some information to. I'm here to serve you, and so I encourage you to send me an email or give me a call, and I'm at your service. I hope you enjoyed our presentation today. Bye-bye. See you next week.